The rest stop camera footage from Highway 93. Travelers who stopped along Highway 93 inches northwest Montana still mention a brief clip that circulated for a week. The footage reportedly showed a man walking out of frame near midnight while snow shifted across the empty lot. A sedan idled by the bathrooms and never moved again before dawn touched the pines. No one claimed ownership of the clip, and investigators never confirmed the original source or the download path. The image quality invited arguments rather than conclusions, and the winter air did nothing to settle them. The nearest town was Polson, and the rest stop sat above the lake on a rise that caught hard weather. State records describe the area as a recurring trouble point for visibility and minor collisions during early winter storms. The site had 2 cameras that faced the lot and a third that covered the vending alcove by the mapboard. Archived notes indicate the equipment came from a basic highway contract that rotated vendors every few years without fanfare. None of the paperwork settled where the clip first appeared, and none identified a technician who signed for backups. Some locals claimed a short video floated through a closed group chat used by road crews. The night in question was the second Friday of early December of 2019, according to dispatch logs from Lake County. Snow had begun by late afternoon, and the wind stacked it against the curbs in ridged lines. Plows ran the main lanes before midnight and left a narrow path through the lot for anyone who needed a break. A power blink left the building lights off for several minutes, and then the generator caught and held steady. The logs show a trooper performed a pass-through at 2320 and saw nothing worth marking on the form. The same logs show no calls from the payphone that evening despite the outage. 3 people can be placed there with enough confidence to matter without reaching beyond the available record. The first was Adam Riley, aged 39, a freight driver moving appliance boxes toward Kalispell for a morning offload. He pulled in for coffee and a quick look at his straps, then sat in the cab while the heater fought the cold. The second was Claire Dominguez, aged 32, a biology graduate from Missoula who drove north to meet a supervisor in Whitefish. She used the restroom and texted a roommate who later saved a screenshot for the county file from 2009. The third was Mark Ellison, aged 50, a state maintenance foreman traveling between stockyards to inspect salt sheds after the first storm. He reported iced hinges on a service gate and left a note inside the supply closet for the morning shift. Accounts diverge when the sedan appears in the frame because the angle creates a small blind spot on the driver door. Riley told a deputy that he saw taillights glow brighter twice, which suggested the driver shifted between gears without moving. That detail appears in state records and survives multiple retellings, even though no mechanical issue was later confirmed. Dominguez only recalled the idling sound and a figure by the mapboard who stood with hands in pockets against the wall. Ellison wrote in a maintenance message that a dark vehicle parked near the trash cans and never rolled forward to the pump. The logs show no pump on site, which means the line refers to the air hose near the curb. The footage itself begins at 23:38 based on a faded timestamp that never received formal validation from anyone. A figure moves from the vending alcove to the passenger side of the sedan with a slow step that never changes pace. Several frames flicker, and the camera catches snow streaks that cross the lens like scratches pulled from film. The figure leans toward the window, then steps away without opening the door and drifts toward the lot exit without lifting a hand. Headlights from a southbound pickup wash the scene for a second, and the figure is gone from the edge of the frame. The sedan continues to idle, and the clip ends without a clear reason for the cutoff. Investigators never confirmed who downloaded the clip or how it left the original storage cabinet inside the utility room. The vendor at the time maintained a small metal box with a lock that technicians opened during scheduled rotation dates. Archive notes describe a misplaced key during late autumn and a temporary latch that could be nudged with a thin blade. The technician who signed for December maintenance reportedly transferred in January and left no forwarding contact beyond a business mailbox. None of this establishes a leak or a deliberate removal, yet the timing continues to bother the county planner. Records conflict on whether the box was inspected before the storm cycle gained momentum. The sedan belonged to an adjunct instructor from Dillon who had borrowed the car from a colleague for a weekend trip. State records confirm the plate and the title while leaving the route vague between Missoula and the reservation boundary. The instructor, aged 42, taught evening classes and managed 2 short shifts at a bookstore to cover early winter bills. She was reportedly traveling to Columbia Falls to help a relative close a seasonal cabin before the deep freezes returned. A receipt from a bakery in Arley places her on the highway after dark with a bag of bread on the passenger seat. That bag appears in a still frame when the headlights glance across the interior during the flicker. Search efforts began the following morning when a wrecker driver reported the sedan idling without a driver and without hazard lights. A deputy arrived first, according to dispatch logs, and found footprints blown over by streaking snow that erased depth. The doors were locked and the keys sat in the center console with a phone buried under a cloth grocery bag. The trunk was empty and the glove box held registration papers and a folded map with a circle around Olney. Dogs brought to the scene struggled with drift lines and veered toward the tree line where wind piled snow into shoulders. Some locals claimed the scent pulled west toward the highway margin before breaking apart near the culvert. Investigators requested broader camera pulls from nearby businesses and workyards that face the corridor between the lake and the pass. Several owners cooperated and offered clips that showed plows and a few pickups and a tanker that turned north before midnight. None of the video showed the instructor on foot, and none revealed a second figure near the sedan during the crucial minutes. Records conflict on whether a white compact parked beyond the main lot for a short interval that might matter. An early report mentions a brief shape near the broken fence where Ellison noted the iced hinges on his form. That note sits in the county file from 2009 because older case folders absorbed later cases for space. In the weeks that followed, the rest stop became a point on a map inside a small conference room in Polson. State records show volunteers checked ditches and borrowed pits along Highway 93 from Jet to Rollins during the first clear days. A local pilot offered a slow pass along the lakeshore and reported nothing visible among the shards of ice near the reeds. Troopers returned at night to test reflections and shadow lines across the lot and compared them with the clip in question. They tried to stage a match with a volunteer who wore a wool coat and moved with the same slow step. The camera never produced the same blur, and the lighting refused to line up with the timestamp. A year later, a storm knocked power again, and the generator failed to start, which forced a temporary closure of the site. During that shutdown, workers replaced cables and found a second card wedged behind a plate that covered the main recorder. The card held partial files that opened badly and stopped before the important sequence began, which frustrated the deputy who carried them. A subcontract report states that earlier models sometimes created ghost indexes when power returned after momentary loss. The vendor suggested the card represented a half-written table and not a deliberate swap by anyone with a goal. Investigators never confirmed that explanation, and the working group chose not to issue a statement. Riley kept driving that corridor for another season and later told a reporter that the clip looked cleaner than the original screen. He believed that someone had trimmed noise, which would require access to software and knowledge that he did not possess. Dominguez finished her degree and left the state, though she kept a copy of the screenshot that showed the time. She said the clock on her phone did not match the timestamp, which raised a small question that no one answered. Ellison retired after the following winter and still maintains that a second vehicle idled near the trash cans for a moment. Investigators never confirmed any vehicle beyond the sedan that appears in the known frames. The instructor's family held a private service in Missoula during early spring of 2020 and kept attention away from the site. They worked with a mediator to settle loan questions and a quiet transfer of the borrowed car back to its owner. State records do not reveal friction between parties, and no civil filings came through the courthouse on Main Street. A single notice asked for information regarding the clip and offered a contact that later expired without follow-through. Some locals claimed a new video surfaced 2 winters later and showed the same figure walking at the edge of the lot. Investigators never confirmed the existence of a second clip and warned against reading too much into blurry frames. The rest stop today looks unchanged to passing drivers who slow on the grade and lean toward the lake when wind rises. The vending alcove still holds a faded map with thumbtack holes near the park boundary and an outdated campground icon. A new lock sits on the utility room, and a paper log hangs from a nail where technicians sign in pencil. Dispatch logs still mark minor collisions and a few stranded motorists when the plows fall behind at shift changes. Travelers step out for a minute and talk about the cold that climbs under sleeves before it settles in bones. The lot records what it can, while the cameras blink against snow that moves like static toward the edge of memory. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly, and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday, then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral, keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2, with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again, and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits, using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder. Then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround because teens use the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully, then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin. Though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits, the tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out 2 sets of footsteps and 1 pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practiced tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight. Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting, She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said, "Good, thank you." The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, risk management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chain stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama, and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood. The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain-link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Merrick almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prince went right up to the chain link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Merrick knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prince turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prince deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fissures along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prince along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prince on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Merrick checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the 3rd night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prince had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway, because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the 2 men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the north yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Merrick did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Merrick wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Merrick stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Merrick's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet mouth. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly, unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fare. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The boy missing after the Anchorage power outage. Neighbors in South Edition remember the night the streetlights failed and the block turned to quiet shapes against Cook Inlet. A rolling outage moved across Anchorage after sunset, reportedly tied to an equipment fault at a substation near Tudor. Within that dark window, a 12-year-old boy left a duplex stairwell and was not seen returning by anyone nearby. The disappearance was recorded in dispatch logs as a welfare check that escalated when the caller could not reach family members. Investigators never confirmed the exact minute he stepped off the landing, and surviving records conflict on the sequence that followed. The boy was named Connor Price, age 12, a sixth grader whose mother worked nights as a certified nursing assistant. She was 39, employed at a facility near Lake Otis, and she left home before the outage reached the neighborhood. Her brother, age 34, an auto parts clerk, reportedly checked on Connor after dinner and found him watching storm updates. The uncle told officers he planned a quick drive toward Midtown for batteries, then doubled back when the traffic signals died. State records list his return time as approximate, and some locals claimed they saw the car pass once without stopping. The second person in the case file is Michael Reese, age 47, a floor technician assigned to overnight cleaning at a public office. He rented a ground floor unit in the same building, and he told officers he met the boy a handful of times. Reese said he heard a door close during the outage and looked through a peephole toward the landing. The hallway was dark, the emergency light flickering, and a shoe squeaked once on painted concrete. Archive notes say Reese could not identify whose steps he heard, and investigators never confirmed whether the sound preceded any exterior movement. The third person is Officer Lena Garvey, age 31, the first uniformed responder to sign the initial incident number that evening. She arrived after the lights returned for 2 minutes, then went down again as if the circuit tripped under load. Garvey walked the alley with a flashlight and found a bicycle leaned beside a trash enclosure behind the laundry room. The bicycle reportedly belonged to Connor, though the county file from 2009 notes the registration sticker was unreadable under winter grime. Records conflict over whether the seat height matched his last measurement, and investigators never confirmed if another child borrowed the bike earlier. Dispatch logs show multiple calls about power fluctuations and elevator alarms during the same half hour across adjacent blocks. A maintenance crew radioed a transformer smell near the corner convenience store, then lost contact when their handhelds failed inside a cinder block stairwell. An outage map captured by a local blogger shows a blotch along 8th Avenue, shaded deeper where circuits overlapped across feeders. The image circulated widely that week, and some locals claimed it proved a deliberate shutdown rather than a fault. Investigators never confirmed the blogger's data source, and state records cautioned that crowd screenshots often distort the real switching boundaries. According to the mother's statement, Connor stayed home with a list on the fridge and reminders about homework and the hallway light. She took the bus toward Lake Otis before sunset and called once from the break room during the first reported flicker. The call dropped after a greeting, and she told detectives the silence felt routine during a storm watch. She tried again on her next break and reached voicemail, then contacted her brother, who said he would drive back immediately. Dispatch logs note her third call at shift change when she reported her nephew missing and asked for a unit to check the duplex. When Garvey stepped inside, the apartment air was cool and smelled like wet socks and an open box of detergent. A pot of macaroni sat crusted on the stove, and a pencil lay under worksheets spread across the table. The window looked toward a utility pole where a crossarm leaned, reportedly cracked by wind during a squall that crossed the water earlier. Garvey noted a jacket missing from hooks by the door and found boots damp with slush left in the corner. The county file from 2009 emphasizes that damp boots were common that month, and investigators never confirmed whether Connor owned another pair. Anchorage police coordinated with utility crews who were moving along feeders to test for faults after repeated trips under load. A crew chief told officers the substation protection had isolated a bad run and that service would stabilize after switching. The crew chief also mentioned a brief arc recorded on supervisory screens around the time neighbors reported the boy leaving. Archived notes capture his phrasing carefully, and state records remind readers that arcs happen often during winter switching. Some locals claimed the arc aligned with the alley and suggested an electrical scare might have drawn the boy outside, though investigators never confirmed that scenario. A security camera at the convenience store faced the corner, then turned off when the outage rolled across that grid square. The owner found corrupted files on the recorder, reportedly caused by repeated starts that exceeded the small battery's tolerance. 2 frames remained legible, showing a figure with a hood stepping past stacked bags of ice and pausing at the curb. The height and jacket length were consistent with a small teenager, though shadows widened the outline against the snow. Records conflict on whether the hood carried a stitched logo, and investigators never confirmed a clear facial image from those frames. Searchers walked the Chester Creek Trail the next morning, moving slowly where tire ruts froze into ridges beside the path. A volunteer found a glove near a bench, blue knit with stretched wrist seams and a smudge of grit on 2 fingers. The mother said Connor owned gloves like that, then grew uncertain when shown a photo that made the knit look darker. The item entered evidence with a notation about uncertain ownership and environmental contamination from overnight frost. Dispatch logs record a second glove reported near the lagoon, then withdrawn when the caller failed to answer a callback, and investigators never confirmed its existence. Is less than hash-own. 0 hash is greater than. Reese told detectives he took out trash during the outage and watched headlights scatter on wet pavement along the alley mouth. He believed he saw 2 silhouettes at the corner, one short and one taller, moving quickly toward a bus stop without speaking. The taller figure held a bag that knocked against a thigh, and the smaller shape glanced back once, then ducked behind a plow berm. Reese admitted uncertainty about distance because a neighbor's generator vibrated metal stairs, blurring his focus during the observation. Archive notes repeat that admission twice, and state records mark the sighting as uncorroborated, though the timing matched the outage window closely. The uncle described his errand as routine, a circuit of 2 stores that usually carried batteries and a small propane canister. He said traffic stalled along C Street because signals blinked, then went dark, and drivers edged through with horn taps. He circled once near the duplex, saw the stairwell light flash, and assumed the unit would stabilize after the next switch. When he reached the door, he called the boy's name and found quiet rooms and a page of homework under a phone. Records conflict over whether he entered the building on his first pass, and investigators never confirmed his drive path using available cameras. During interviews, classmates mentioned a plan for sledding after the next snowfall, with a meeting point near a small park in Midtown. One friend reportedly texted about a borrowed sled and a repaired headlamp that could run on backup batteries. The phone recovered from the table contained an unfinished reply that referenced the headlamp but not the meeting point specifically. The county file from 2009 highlights the gap between the unfinished reply and the last status report recorded by the device. Investigators never confirmed whether the boy intended to leave for that plan during the outage, though some locals claimed they heard excited voices outdoors. Weather logs show gusts along the inlet that lifted salty spray and glazed sidewalks through brief freezing drizzle. Utility crews reported linemen slipping on ladders and pausing work to salt rails at a substation gate. A transit driver radioed about passengers crowding on board while streetlights remained dark, then asked dispatch for guidance about unsupervised minors. That message appears in dispatch logs 3 minutes after the first welfare check, placing both threads inside the same operational window. Investigators never confirmed whether the driver passed the boy's block, and state records refrain from connecting those events beyond proximity and shared conditions. A resident 2 buildings east kept a paper notebook for power blanks because appliances sometimes failed during voltage dips. He wrote times in blocky numbers and kept tallies for each blank counted in the kitchen with a candle burning nearby. His notes include a scribble labeled child voice, then a short arrow toward the alley where the bicycle was recovered earlier. Archived notes indicate the resident could not recall whether the voice came before or after the second deep blackout. The county file from 2009 cautions that manual notations during outages are notoriously fuzzy, and investigators never confirmed the accuracy of the marks. By the second day, snow hardened into ruts and footprints lost shape under municipal plow passes along the trail network. A drone team flew grids above the greenbelt, then battled interference near transmission lines that hummed as power stabilized across feeders. The team reported brief signal jitter along one corridor that paralleled the alley and turned toward a drainage culvert under the avenue. Some locals claimed the jitter implied an object inside the culvert, though the pilot later tested and reproduced interference near similar lines. Investigators never confirmed any anomaly beyond routine radio noise, and state records treat the flight logs as inconclusive but properly archived. Several tips arrived from neighborhoods west of Minnesota Drive, where residents reported a boy matching Connor's height near a bus kiosk. One caller described a child in a gray jacket asking about a route to Turnagain, then walking away when a bus arrived. Another caller insisted the boy rode north toward a stop near Northern Lights, carrying a bag shaped like a folded sled. The uncle told officers Connor did not own a folding sled, then paused and said a friend might have loaned one earlier. Records conflict on whether that friend was contacted promptly, and investigators never confirmed the kiosk sightings beyond uncollected footprints on packed snow. On the third day, the mother returned to the duplex with an officer and found a faint shoe mark on the stairwell landing. The print was partial, smudged by slush, and measured close to the size the boy wore during the previous winter. A second print overlapped at an angle that suggested a quick turn toward the alley door rather than the interior hallway. Photographs entered the county file from 2009 show grainy edges and flash reflections from chipped paint across the riser. Some locals claim the prints proved a rushed exit, though investigators never confirmed gate direction from marks that degraded under repeated entries. A week later, state records show the case coded for continuing investigation with periodic checks when new outage reports surface. Utilities repaired the cracked crossarm and replaced fuses that had tripped during the storm, then published a maintenance summary on their website. The summary listed the outage window within broader operations and mentioned no injuries recorded during the night of the disappearance. Families in the neighborhood saved copies of the page, and archived notes record residents arguing over the meaning of terse language. Investigators never confirmed any link between the maintenance summary and the case, and dispatch logs closed the thread without additional explanation. The mother kept working nights, reportedly moving to a different facility after winter gave way to an early break in ice. She told a counselor she avoided the alley and took a longer path around the block when errands required walking past the stairwell. Reese transferred to a different building, and the uncle changed shifts at the parts store, then stopped answering reporters who knocked. Some locals claimed these changes were meaningful, while neighbors said people adjust their routes when winter ends and work schedules shift. The county file from 2009 preserves both views without judgment, and investigators never confirmed that any adjustment held investigative weight. Years later, the duplex paint flaked in the same stairwell, and the door closer still dragged when the hallway cooled. A new tenant found a child's library card under the second step, then turned it over to a clerk downtown. The clerk checked the number and found the card expired before the outage, then wrote a note that attached to the record. Archived notes say the mother could not identify the card as her son's, and records conflict on the listed address. Investigators never confirmed a connection, though the discovery reopened conversations that move through Anchorage whenever lights flicker against winter clouds. The stories. Ranger station logs noted a missing hiker at noon. The radio crackled just after lunch, and the clipboard showed a blank line beside a borrowed bear spray canister. The word missing sat in block letters on the duty sheet, and the clock over the map board ticked louder than usual. Renata Vale worked the desk that week, 38, seasonal ranger with a stubborn streak for clean paperwork. The station sat outside a popular canyon where the trail ran through scrub pine, and July heat made the air taste metallic. Her plan for the day was simple: clear the lost and found shelf and call 2 vendors about water filters. Plans changed when a volunteer handed her the trail phone and said a worried brother was holding. He said his sister failed to text from the halfway point, and he used the word routine like a spell. He gave a name that did not exactly match the sign-in sheet, and his voice thinned when Renata asked about clothing and pack color. He had a screenshot of their last conversation, time-stamped just before noon, and said a ranger blog recommended checking the canyon switchbacks first. Renata felt the quiet alarm that starts in a seasoned ranger's hands, the kind that steadies rather than shakes. She called the number on the permit sticker that matched the closest name, and a voicemail box chirped with a clipped greeting. She checked the station cameras that watched the parking turnouts and found a silver sedan rolling in at 10:20. The driver wore a brimmed hat and taped the ends of the laces, a detail Renata wrote down because details age poorly when pressure arrives. The volunteer named Marco searched the trailhead kiosk for the morning log, while Renata stepped into the sun and scanned the ridge. Wind pushed dry heat across the gravel, and a jay scolded from the utility pole. She keyed dispatch and said they had a potential overdue hiker, not confirmed, and that initial checks were underway. She kept the language tight because words build momentum, and momentum brings helicopters that the budget cannot always afford. A woman in gym shorts approached with a dog and said she had heard a shout near the lower falls, short and sharp like a name. The dog sniffed the air and leaned toward the creek, then lost interest and sat her down. Renata asked about time and direction, then thanked her and pressed the note card against the map with a magnet. Witness statements fail without anchors, so she pinned the details to the grid and reviewed them aloud. Marco returned with the binder of trail camera stills that interns pulled from a motion unit near the bridge. The images showed the brimmed hat at 11:16, then again at noon on the switchback above the falls. The shirt color looked different under the dappled light, a common effect on digital stills that gave Renata a moment of doubt. She printed 2 frames and circled the pack strap, then clipped them to a clipboard for the field check. Her simple plan melted fully when dispatch called back with archived calls. A person had phoned the tip line at 11:42 and asked about trail closures on the East Rim, then hung up when asked for a callback number. The caller used a masked service that had failed before, and the audio had that empty room sound that suggested a roadside kiosk or a cheap motel. Renata pressed a knuckle against the map and agreed to log the call as related. She put together a step-by-step, starting light and staying local to the canyon. First, a hasty sweep from the bridge to the switchbacks with 1 ranger and 1 volunteer. Second, a parking lot inventory to match plates to permits and to note any vehicles with cooling engines that did not match sign-ins. Third, a witness walk with the dog owner to the lower falls, with a promise to return her to the trailhead within the hour. She radioed the plan and heard the click of acknowledgement from Wyatt Perales, 32, trail tech and steady boots in rough ground. They moved out along the creek, and the summer smell shifted from dust to algae and sunscreen. A couple in sun hats pointed to a narrow ledge where someone had left a crushed water bottle and a candy wrapper. Renata photographed the area with a department phone, then bagged the trash because trash turns into stories when the wrong eyes find it. She kept her sentences short on the radio, and noted her times with a pen that left grooves deeper than the ink. At the switchback, Wyatt found boot scuffs that angled off the tread and into scrubs so tight it would punish any shortcut. He pointed to a pressed patch of grass, then to a low branch with a pale scrape that matched soft plastic. Renata crouched and saw a faint thread from athletic tape, the same color she remembered from the still. The thread clung to rough bark, a small but useful tether between the images and the ground. They moved higher and reached a shallow spur where the view opened into a dry basin. On the spur, a pair of hikers said they passed a woman alone who looked back often, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The hikers spoke slowly and paused to remember, then agreed to write brief statements at the station later that afternoon. They offered a photo from a distance that showed only a shape in heat shimmer, and the horizon looked bleached and wide. Renata asked the brother for more context by text, keeping questions narrow and practical. What snacks did she favor? Any injuries last year? And did she ever speak about this specific canyon? He replied that his sister planned the hike to test a new route from a guide forum and sent a blurry screenshot of a message board thread. A username bragged about a hidden shelf that saved 20 minutes, and that sentence pressed a new line into Renata's plan. She called the district's archive and asked for old incident notes related to the shelf, and the clerk said there were 2 minor rescues on a heat weekend 3 summers ago. Those notes described short slips and stubborn walkers and contained a detail that felt right and wrong at the same time. Both incidents started at noon when shadows shortened and depth perception failed, and both involved hikers who disliked crowds and sought quiet. Another message arrived from the brother that changed tone from worried to careful. He said a coworker reportedly spotted a silver sedan at a grocery near the highway at 1:30 with the brimmed hat visible through the windshield. He said the coworker did not want to get involved, and that felt useful in a different way. Renata thanked him and wrote the time down, then circled highway with a question mark that drew a slow breath from Wyatt. They pushed through manzanita to reach the rumored shelf and found it narrower than described, with a crumbling margin that looked unfriendly. A faint shoe print showed a split tread that matched a popular brand, and a smear on the rock smelled like cheap bug spray. Wyatt anchored a line to a juniper and leaned just far enough to see a small alcove with shade and a clean view of the bridge. A person could wait there unseen, then return to the trail when passing groups moved on. Renata called dispatch to log the shelf and asked for a quiet check on the grocery footage if the store manager would allow it without a formal request. She kept the ask light, and the clerk at the store reportedly agreed to review only the parking lot from 1:15 to 1:45. While they waited, they spoke to a fisherman who said he had heard someone practicing a greeting near the bridge, polite and warm, the way people rehearse before calling an office. They returned to the station to regroup and found the dog owner had kept her promise about the statements. She drew a crude map of her walk and marked the spot where the shout came, which lined up with the shelf by a neat stroke. Renata checked the plate list from the lot, and one entry bothered her because the registration sticker covered an older color. That usually meant a cheap repaint, often done quickly when a car changes hands among friends. The call from the store came back while the clock swept toward 4. Footage reportedly showed a silver sedan near the outer edge, and the driver wore a brimmed hat. The camera caught the driver opening the trunk, then closing it without removing anything. The driver sat for a full minute, then left the lot with a slow signal that suggested careful timing rather than confusion. That action made less sense if a hiker was lost, and more sense if a narrative needed space. Renata asked the brother to send any recent photos of his sister's gear so they could match brands and colors to the thread on the branch. He sent a camping picture from spring, and the pack straps matched the stills with unnerving accuracy. He also sent a photo of a laminated media badge from a fitness channel and apologized for forgetting to mention that side gig. Renata stared at the badge and felt the click of pieces rubbing into place. She pulled the permit files again and found a second entry from the morning that used a near match to the name, with a transposed letter that looked accidental at first glance. The second entry had a note in different handwriting that said, "Early shoot near bridge, approved by office." The office had approved no such shoot as far as Renata knew, and a deep memory of an email warning about unauthorized product videos rose to the surface. Those videos sometimes used staged trouble to capture attention, then rode the wave for clicks and ad buys. She contacted the regional office and asked whether a crew had requested permission that day, and the answer came back tidy and negative. The office asked for details, and Renata kept her language cool and focused on logs and times. She included the masked call and the quiet shelf, and the fact that a brimmed hat appeared where a plan would benefit from a dramatic turn. She asked for guidance on whether to treat the case as a welfare check or as a permit violation with a side of false alarm. Before the office replied, Wyatt flagged a new detail from the camera stills that had felt unimportant earlier. The brimmed hat in the second still carried a small pin that caught the sun, and the same pin appeared on the media badge in the spring photo. It was a tiny compass rose with 3 points bent, a logo for a training program that marketed grit and quiet strength. The pin created a line between online identity and trail identity, often a line people try to blur when views are currency. The volunteer team returned from the upper spur with a clean report and no sign of distress along the ridge. A group of teenagers said they watched a drone rise above the bridge and glide toward the shelf, then return quickly when someone shouted about rules. The teenagers filmed the drone on a phone, and the video captured the brimmed hat figure leaning on the railing, then turning away when the shout landed. Renata saved the clip and documented the time, then asked the group to leave contact details in case the office needed follow-up. As evening light softened, dispatch called with a quiet advisory. A patrol unit had found a silver sedan parked at a scenic turnout 15 miles east, empty and cooling, with a folded jacket in the back. The officer waited nearby without lights and reported a second vehicle pulling in close, then leaving when the cruiser rolled forward. The plate on the second car belonged to a rental agency with a flexible policy about credit cards, a detail Renata captured without judgment. The office finally replied and advised a welfare check with a parallel inquiry into misuse of emergency channels. They recommended a measured approach that prioritized safety and avoided public drama. Renata agreed, and then called the brother again and asked him to come to the station, explaining that in-person rooms make details easier to manage. He arrived with shoulders high and hands careful, and he looked like someone who disliked being on the wrong side of a counter. He admitted the channel sometimes staged challenges, and that his sister had pitched a solo speed test that needed daylight and a sense of risk. He insisted that no real danger was planned, only a late check-in, followed by a triumphant return and a lesson about preparation. He said a friend reportedly stood by with water near the highway, and the masked call was about closures because crowds ruined dramatic timing. He said he panicked when she missed the planned text by a full hour and called the station because the bit felt wrong. Renata listened and typed, then asked to speak with the sister by phone. The brother made a call on speaker, and the brimmed hat answered with a small breath, then a quick apology that sounded practiced. She said she was safe and nearby, and that she feared trouble once she realized how many people had watched the bridge. She agreed to meet at the station within 30 minutes and added that the shelf was a mistake because the rock felt greasy and mean. She arrived with salt on her face and a steady gaze, 34, freelance trainer and editor for a mid-sized channel. She wore the pin on the brim and kept her hands open on the counter, then gave a full account that matched much of the timeline. She described the shelf and the alcove and admitted the staged silence to build tension for a cut. She said the drone operator backed out when a shout scared him and that the grocery stop was a pause to decide whether to end the bit early. Renata walked her through the consequences with a calm voice and clear steps. They would log the misuse of the term missing in the station ledger and forward a report on the masked call to the office. They would recommend a fine for the drone flight near the bridge and review the permit files for the transposed name entry. They would also offer a voluntary donation to the volunteer team for the hours spent and recommend a public safety note if the channel posted any edited footage. The woman nodded and said she understood, then asked whether the station planned to call the county. Renata said the county dispatch already sat in the loop and had agreed to remain cooperative as long as the channel avoided inflaming viewers. She added that the station took missing reports seriously because moments consume resources, and that even staged quiet pressures real systems. The woman agreed to record a clear statement and accepted a brochure on safe filming that looked oddly gentle in the harsh light. Wyatt stepped outside and watched the last cars roll out of the lot, and the air finally cooled enough to feel kind. The dog from earlier barked once from a passing truck, and the fisherman from the creek lifted two fingers without slowing. Renata filed the forms and wrote a final note that tied the shelf to the old rescues and the pin to the badge and the masked call to timing. The station lights hummed and the clock hands slid past 6, then found their mark without ceremony. By the time the brother and sister left, the word missing on the duty sheet had a line through it. Renata kept the original note card with the magnet hole because records tell stories when memory wants to embellish. The office would likely call tomorrow and ask for clarifications, and the drone policy would probably gain a new sentence. She felt the usual mix of relief and irritation that follows a false alarm, and the strange sympathy for people who turn risk into currency. Later, the channel posted a short video that downplayed the panic, and the comments argued about rules and grit. The station received 2 thank you emails from hikers who heard the news secondhand and a complaint from a person who disliked the fines on principle. Renata archived the messages and watered the plant on the windowsill, then wrote one more line in the log about the shelf that was not a shortcut. The sentence ended with a plain warning that noon creates flat shadows and false confidence, a small truth inside a larger one. In quiet moments after a shift like that, she believed most people want a story that forgives them. Trails do not forgive, they teach. And the classroom never closes just because cameras blink. The station would open again at 7, and the clipboard would carry new names, and the clock would tick in the same steady way. Somewhere on the ridge, a jay would scold the wind, and the shelf would wait with its narrow promise, ready to turn bravado into paperwork. The woman who disappeared near Carver's Gap. Travelers who stopped at the high pullouts near Carver's Gap reported a woman who waved once, then walked into thin spruce. The trail ran along the bald, where wind hit with steady force from the Tennessee side. Lights stayed flat and cold despite late afternoon, and the ridgeline carried radio traffic from both counties. No one noted a plate because the parking area mixed hikers and locals without clear lines. The first call reached dispatch just before sunset, according to logs released later. Her name in the county file from 2009 matched a teacher who had moved between Carter and Avery over several years. She was 38 and worked part-time as a substitute while picking up seasonal museum hours in Johnson City. Friends said she came for the rhododendron bloom and stayed for the quiet above the state line. She reportedly carried a cheap handheld map and a stainless bottle marked with blue tape. Investigators never confirmed whether she owned a reliable compass, despite several receipts found in storage. The last certain sighting placed her near the wooden post where the Appalachian Trail heads north across the grass. A retired lineman named Carl said she asked about a side path that cut toward Round Bald before the weather turned. He described a calm voice and a careful walker who checked the sky twice and tightened her jacket sleeves. His watch read 4:30 by his account, and his memory stayed fixed on the sound of traffic below. Some locals claimed Carl changed the time later, which state records do not fully address. Dispatch logs mark a second report from a couple who parked beside a dented sedan with faded county stickers. They watched a woman stand near the information board and fold a copy of a trail brochure into a narrow strip. The man recalled her glancing at a silver pickup with an aftermarket light bar, then stepping away without hesitation. The woman recalled a slight limp that appeared only on the downhill portion near the first switchback. Records conflict on whether those statements were taken the same night or days later. Rain moved across Roan High Knob after dark, and patrols split between the paved lot and the forest roads. A ranger from the North Carolina side coordinated with a deputy from the Tennessee side using a shared radio channel. Volunteer searchers gathered near Carver's Gap just after midnight and walked grid lines under steady drizzle and shallow fog. They found boot marks that matched her size near a side trail where moss hid pooled water. Investigators never confirmed those impressions because runoff smeared edges before a cast could cure. Archived notes mention a lightweight day pack found under low branches around a quarter-mile from the main path. Inside were snack wrappers and a folded paper with a grocery list and a museum shift date. A phone sat in the outer pocket with a drained battery and a hair elastic wrapped twice around it. The screen held shallow scratches but no cracks, and the case showed a faded tourist sticker. Technicians pulled the card and recovered brief texts that ended earlier than the last reported sighting. Avery County reports list two unconfirmed leads involving a silver pickup seen idling near the pullout before rain. One hiker said the truck crept past the lot twice, which he found strange given poor visibility and slick pavement. Another hiker said the driver leaned forward and checked the mirror often while the engine surged at irregular intervals. Investigators never confirmed whether the pickup belonged to a local contractor who worked on fences near the highway. Records conflict on the license digits and the description of a sticker behind the rear glass. State records show a previous call involving the same teacher on Roan Mountain during early spring of 2019. She reportedly got turned around in sudden fog near Grassy Ridge and waited beside a cairn until voices approached. The party who found her said she stayed calm and kept talking about frost hollows and bird calls to stay oriented. An incident note described firm boots and a careful pace with brakes at regular intervals despite dropping temperature. Investigators never confirmed whether that episode affected her later planning or gear choices before June. In the week after the disappearance, family and colleagues organized small teams and checked shelters to the north. A museum co-worker carried printouts and asked pieced questions at hostels and gas stations between Elizabethton and Banner Elk. Several people remembered her spending coins on coffee and a pastry at a market near Roan Mountain State Park. Others insisted they saw someone else with similar hair and a similar jacket, which complicated the running timeline. The county file from 2009 contains those notes without a firm ruling on identity. A storm knocked power lines across the ridge and slowed organized searching while crews worked along the highway shoulders. Helicopter support reportedly stood by until wind readings dropped into a safer band above the open balds. Heat signatures came and went as fog shifted across gullies and pooled in low draws between thick spruce. Teams marked possible tracks that crossed and recrossed animal prints near a wet seep where runoff gathered. Investigators never confirmed a single continuous line that matched her boots from the parking area. Weeks later, a trail runner found a stainless bottle wedged under a root beside a shallow step. Blue tape clung to the metal, and a fingerprint technician lifted partials that matched previous samples from her apartment. The cap showed light grit and a torn gasket, which might explain a sweet smell noted by two searchers. Some locals claim the bottle had not been there during early sweeps, which raised questions about movement after rain. Records conflict on when the site was first photographed and tagged for follow-up. The apartment in Johnson City held careful stacks of notebooks and a shoebox filled with admission stickers. One notebook mentioned a plan to walk the balds alone to map views for a lesson about settlement routes. Another page listed bus times and an alternate ride from a coworker whose statement later changed on 2 points. The coworker first said she offered a ride to the Gap, then said she offered a pickup from the Gap. Investigators never confirmed either offer, which left timing gaps across the late afternoon window. Bank records show a small withdrawal that morning and no further activity after the day of the hike. A library card saw used 2 days earlier for field guides that matched the notes found near the day pack. A phone account tied to a prepaid plan rolled over minutes on schedule without manual action from family. Technicians found no logins after the last tower handshake near the state line on the ridge. Dispatch logs carry that timestamp and mark it as the final verified ping. A rumor formed around an old farm road that drops toward a creek where anglers leave crushed cans. A property owner told deputies about a woman who waved once near a locked gate before stepping into Laurel. He could not fix the date and changed the season at least twice during follow-up interviews. His dog growled at the brush that evening, and he found cords of stacked wood disturbed along the fence. Investigators never confirmed the account, and state records caution that memory shifted after news coverage. Later that summer, a faded sedan matching the parking lot vehicle was towed from a private lot near Elk Park. A shop owner said the driver left it overnight and never returned to settle a quoted repair. The owner thought the driver was male based on height and a cap pulled low across the brow. The tag returned to a different county, and paperwork took time because of mismatched mailing records. Archive notes say the lead produced no direct link to the missing teacher despite initial excitement. By fall, snow brushed the high grass, and searchers changed tactics to check drainages for winter evidence. Teams followed game trails where leaves bridged small streams and gusts erased prints within minutes. A jacket scrap turned up near a low snag, but color comparisons did not match clothing in photographs. A volunteer insisted the fabric felt similar to a liner she wore during spring trips on the same ridge. Investigators never confirmed the match, and records conflict on whether the sample was cataloged correctly. The museum held a small gathering where colleagues read notes about her lectures on birds and trade routes across the mountains. A student recalled her steady pace during a field trip and a habit of counting steps between viewpoints. Another student remembered a hesitant smile that appeared when someone mentioned weather reports and trail etiquette near fragile plants. Some locals claimed she had hinted at moving away, which her sister denied in interviews with a regional reporter. The county file from 2009 keeps both statements without comment on reliability. Winter closed the high road at intervals and ice grew along shaded cuts where plows could not hold traction. Crews marked fallen limbs and flagged slick corners, while visitors stayed lower in the valley towns. The case slipped from headlines but stayed in quarterly summaries prepared for both county commissions. Detectives traded notes about similar disappearances along the border where ridges tangle and lines divide jurisdiction. Investigators never confirmed meaningful overlap beyond weather patterns and occasional vehicle descriptions. In spring, a new ranger reviewed the folder and walked the first 3 miles north at dawn. He carried the printed dispatch logs and paused where the bale wire fence dips near a wet meadow. He noted how sound traveled along the bald and how voices blended with trucks grinding up the grade. A sudden shift in cloud shadow hid the post where the trail turns and the path narrowed near wind-stunted trees. His memo suggested a simple misturn compounded by weather and fatigue without clear evidence of intent. Years have not settled the case, and no court file closes the matter with certainty. Reportedly, a hiker sometimes meets a man who still repeats the time and the steps and the exact wind. He stands by the wooden post and points where the grass folds over and the path looks wider than it is. Some locals claim she walked out on a different day and left by a service road near the towers. Investigators never confirmed that ending, and records conflict enough to keep the question alive near Carver's Gap. The stories. This night guard filed a missing hours report. The file started as something routine, a timestamp discrepancy in a small town security log. A night guard at a regional warehouse filed a missing hours report, claiming his time card didn't match the hours he'd actually worked. The report was short, oddly calm, and dated early March of 2019. No one thought much of it until he never came back to work. His name was Leon Hartridge, 43, a former truck driver who'd switched to night security after a back injury. The warehouse sat off a rural interstate, the kind of place that smells like cold concrete and diesel even after midnight. Leon's shift started at 10 and ended at 6. His wife told investigators he usually came home by 6:30, drank coffee, watched old westerns, then slept until afternoon. That pattern broke on a Wednesday night when he didn't clock out. The initial assumption was simple. Maybe he quit. Maybe he got another job, or maybe he just walked away. But the following morning, his supervisor found his lunchbox, still sealed, and a half-empty thermos on the break room counter. His reflective vest hung neatly on a hook, radio still attached. The last digital swipe of his ID was logged at 3:42 a.m., then nothing. The company filed a basic absence form, but by Friday, the sheriff's office got involved. They reviewed the overnight CCTV, 6 cameras in total. 5 worked fine. The 6th, covering the north loading dock, froze at exactly 3:41 a.m. Then, 3 minutes later, all motion detection stopped. It wasn't just a blackout. The file header showed it had been manually overwritten. Leon's brother, a retired electrician, offered to check his apartment when calls went unanswered. Inside, he found Leon's keys on the counter, wallet in the same place he always left it, and a spiral notebook on the kitchen table. The last entry, written in his blocky handwriting, read, "Clock shows 4 when I walk out. Feels later. Light's wrong color again." Investigators traced that note back to similar remarks he'd made to coworkers in the weeks before. One of them, a forklift operator named Ray Corbin, told deputies Leon had been bothered by something about the new lighting system. The company had replaced the overhead fluorescents with motion-activated LEDs that flickered under certain camera angles. He said it messed with his sense of time, Ray recalled. He'd come in thinking it was midnight and swear it was almost morning. At first, police treated the notebook as irrelevant, a tired man rambling about lights. Then came the dispatch logs. A 3:48 a.m. call had been placed from Leon's company-issued phone to a non-emergency county line. The recording still exists. He told the operator he needed to document something about the schedule. His tone was formal, detached, like he was making a statement rather than asking for help. The operator tried to clarify what he meant, but the line dropped mid-sentence. The call lasted 53 seconds. When they checked the network records, they found something else. The call didn't route through the cell tower nearest the warehouse. It bounced from a tower 30 miles east across the river. That's the same direction Leon's phone was last pinged before it went offline, near an unfinished section of the old state bypass, closed since 2011. Deputies drove out there and found fresh tire tracks in the gravel, leading toward a fenced construction lot. No vehicle was recovered. Weeks passed. Local news ran a single story: warehouse guard missing after time card dispute. Public interest faded quickly. And as fashion, local news wanted the power. But in June, the company's new HR contractor discovered something odd while auditing payroll. Leon's time card for that final night didn't just show missing hours, it showed duplicated entries. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., his ID was logged twice at two different doors, seconds apart. One swipe at the front entrance, one in the mechanical hallway. Same ID, same timestamp. Technically impossible. Investigators re-examined the internal server that housed the door logs. That's when they noticed a secondary access profile had been created using Leon's credentials, but tagged with a different department code, one belonging to the electrical maintenance division. The account was active for 1 week, then deleted. IT records listed the administrator as temporary systems testing. No one at the warehouse remembered authorizing it. The more they dug, the stranger the timeline became. Archived footage from prior nights showed brief blips in the digital clock, displays 3-second shifts where the time rolled backward before correcting itself. Leon had written about this in another note. Clock skipped again. Same moment the hum cut out. Technicians later confirmed that during those same minutes, a backup generator was cycling power for a series of sublevel fans. Only a few workers even knew the sublevels existed. They weren't active parts of the facility anymore. When authorities finally inspected the lower level, they found old offices sealed off with plastic sheeting and warning signs for asbestos. In one corner sat an unplugged time clock terminal dated 1994. The paper spool inside it still contained partial punch cards, yellowed and brittle. One of them bore Leon's employee number, printed faintly beside the name of a former contractor who died years earlier. That discovery reframed everything. Somehow, the modern ID system had merged data with the obsolete one, producing overlapping records that made it appear Leon was in two places at once. The missing hours report he'd filed wasn't about unpaid wages, it was about time itself, slipping in a way he couldn't explain. The investigators never found conclusive proof of tampering, though one retired systems tech told local reporters that the company's old mainframe still ran partial code from a discontinued scheduling program called ShiftLine. He claimed that under rare conditions, like a power cycle during data backup, it could duplicate entries with original punch data from the archive, labeling them with active credentials. If that happened when Leon's ID was scanned, it might have triggered a fatal error, but that's still theory. What's factual is this. The same Friday, the audit uncovered the duplicate entries. A highway cleanup crew reported finding a fragment of a reflective safety vest along the bypass construction route. It matched the brand issued to Leon's team. DNA analysis was inconclusive exposure, and time had degraded it, but one detail stood out. The vest's zipper pull contained traces of oil consistent with the warehouse's loading dock equipment. In the end, the case file closed under missing person, presumed deceased. Officially, no foul play. Unofficially, everyone agreed something in that building broke his sense of time before he vanished. His wife still keeps the notebook on a shelf. The last page, just beneath his final note, has a short line written in different ink, maybe added later, maybe the same night. It reads, "Clock shows 4, door says 3. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man noticed an inconsistency, tried to document it, and disappeared between 2 readings of the same minute. Whether that was error, accident, or something stranger about how those systems looped, no one can say for certain. The warehouse eventually upgraded its entire security network, scrapping every trace of the old servers. But the missing hours report still sits in the county archive, a single-page statement with the timestamp frozen at 3:42 a.m., the same moment the camera went dark,